To begin at the beginning, in nearly every sense, the early history and formation of the town of Wellesley and of this church are one and the same. As we look back, the beginning was marked with some controversy, strife, delays, uncertainties, periods of setbacks, and periods of growth. Perhaps all the usual markings of a 200-plus year history. As the budding nation was working toward a new and fresh start, and with an identity separate and apart from England, so too was New England. And so too were those in this very area we now call Wellesley, and by extension, members of this church we call Wellesley Congregational, our village church. It is a unique and compelling story. To invoke a Low Country Gullah phrase, as members of this church, it is your story. It is our story. It is his story. It is history. As many are aware, this area was initially part of Needham and known as West Needham. In its own formation, Needham had split with Dedham in 1711, and as was the custom, the Needham residents built a meeting house/church the following year. Called First Parish, it was the 14th church to be built in Massachusetts. It is important to note that in those days, the town's meeting house and church were one and the same, and members of the community were required to attend services and provide financial support for the preacher. First Parish was located at the corner of Nahoyden and Central Avenue, just beyond North Hill, approximately 4 miles from the center of West Needham. Assuming horse and buggy transportation, clipping along at an average of 5 to 8 miles per hour, I Googled it. It would take those from West Needham approximately an hour to get to First Parish. A journey way too far for many of the West Needham folk. For this reason and perhaps others, West Needham and members, essentially farmers, now wanted their own independence. Following in Needham's footsteps and its previous split with Dedham, West Needham decided to exert this independence in 1774 after a fire destroyed much of First Parish. In a bit of controversy and lore, some East Needham felt that West Needham residents had something to do with that fire. In any event, the first steps toward an independent West Needham were made, and construction on a first meeting house commenced in 1775 on a half-acre lot on the north side of present-day Church Street. Central Avenue did not exist, as the area north of us was just forest. Timing was not ideal, however, as it took another 20 years for this building to be completed, delayed by the outbreak of the Revolutionary War. In terms of the war, ultimately more than 300 men from Needham's total population of 1,000 served before the war was over. 59 of 82 men who helped build the West Needham Meeting House went to fight in the Battle of Lexington. 5 residents in total lost their lives in that battle, including John Bacon, one of the West Needham residents who wanted to split from the Needham Church. Ultimately, the remains of 11 Revolutionary War veterans were buried in our cemetery, along with 2 Civil War veterans. In 1778, the West Needham Precinct was created. Still part of Needham, but is now a precinct, was created as an act of legislature, an important milestone in the direction of independence. The locals, as we'll call them, finally finished the first meeting house in 1798. The date we use is when this church was organized, but not yet established. Can you hear Brad Harding emphasizing this point? Not established, organized. It is the date which has been placed on the National Register of Historic Place plaques, which will be unveiled today. And by the way, the first preacher was hired in 1799. Reverend Thomas Noyes, at age 30, a native of Acton and a Harvard grad, went on to serve this parish well for the next 34 years, leaving the congregation in 1833 in relatively strong footing in terms of membership and financial position. He would be the first of 18 senior pastors who have served this church. His remains are interred, as many of you know, under the steps of the East Main Sanctuary entrance. Immediately following Noy's retirement, a second meeting house was built with a slightly greater resemblance to a church, albeit modest. In the same year, 1834, the Boston and Worcester Railroad came through Wellesley, a factor which would contribute significantly to the development of this area and transition from strictly rural to a place where wealthy businessmen in Boston would build summer estates. The 1840s were a period of some dissent and financial struggle for the congregation. Several pastors were dismissed. Sorry, I can't provide that list, but I certainly am curious. In 1847, one of those unpopular pastors led a group of 28 members who split off to form the Congregational Church at Grantville, or North Village as it was called at the time, now Wellesley Hills. However, the remaining half of the 19th century was marked by a number of improvements and growth. An important turning point historically came in 1864 when the congregation reorganized as Wellesley Congregational Society, and as a separate corporation took ownership from the West Precinct of the building and the cemetery. So the building no longer served as both a church and a town hall. They used scripts to effect this purchase. Looking much like a cross, I've seen them in our archives, much like a cross between I would submit a pledge card and a check. These scripts were used in the purchase of the property and can still be found, as I alluded to, in our records. Two of the individuals who contributed significantly to this upward trend were Henry Durant, a successful lawyer in Boston, and Charles Dana, a retired trader from the East India Trading Company. Both had by then established estates in Wellesley and were active church members during this time period. Together they would facilitate the construction of this congregation's third church, which was completed in 1872. With Durant on the building committee, this third church was built with the help of an architect, H&J.E. Billings, which means it would look more like a church, which is consistent with the establishment of the society, the purchase by the members of the church property from the West Needham Precinct, and the intended use of this building as a church only. It faced north, whereas the previous two buildings faced south and east, respectively. This northward-facing building was a nod to the importance of the railroad to the community, as the station was located a mere 100 yards away, essentially where it is today. Not bad for membership. Get off the train, what do you see? A brief note on Mr. Durant and Mr. Dana. An interesting story in and of itself. Henry Durant and his wife Pauline experienced a sort of religious awakening following the death of their only son at the tender age of 8. As part of this, Henry and Pauline established Wellesley College, which had its first classes in 1875, shortly after the completion of our third church. Now, one may assume that Charles Dana started Dana School, but that is not correct. It was Henry Durant who started Dana School as a preparatory school for Wellesley College. If you could pass the requirements at Dana, you were, at least then, guaranteed to be accepted at Wellesley College. So what did Charles Dana do? Well, the answer to this begins with the second, not the third church. Now, Charles Dana provided direct financial support for the construction of the third church, to be sure, but he also purchased the old and second church building. He paid $1,000 for it and had it moved to the north part of his estate on Grove Street, where he converted the building into a boarding house. A decade later, he would convert the building again and essentially gave it to Durant for use in Durant's preparatory school for Wellesley College. It became the central building of what was to become Dana Hall School, until it was torn down in the 1970s. Coincidentally, the same year Dana Hall opened in 1881, The precinct known as West Needham was incorporated as an independent community of about 2,000. So the groundwork laid in 1775, that fateful meeting that I mentioned before following the burning of the first church by the West Needham residents, had finally and officially come to pass. I should say the precinct came to know as Wellesley at that point in time. But this occurrence was 106 years later. When you enter Wellesley today, the signs will be marked 1881. But you'll now know the rest of the story. Progress continued. The church was growing and the cemetery was developing as well. In the 1850s, the cemetery was expanded by the purchase of 13,000 square feet of land west of the cemetery. With contributions from the Betsy Brown Trust, major improvements were made to the cemetery, which was filling up, but it had deteriorated. In 1877, to alleviate the scarcity of space in the cemetery, the church acquired land on Brook Street, which later became Woodlawn Cemetery, and since then has served this town as its main non-sectarian cemetery. In 1879, the cemetery closed to all burials except for private plots, which comprised nearly all of the western section of the grounds. In 1881, the first bylaws for the church were established. In 1891, the old Congregational Society was reorganized as Wellesley Congregational Church, 1891. The society had fulfilled its objectives and was no longer needed. In 1893, approximately 140 remains, including 67 people from the Bullard, Parker, and Smith tombs, were transferred from the old burial ground here to Woodlawn Cemetery to make space for the new addition on the southwest corner of the church where the tombs had previously been located. In 1897, the construction of a new parish house extension was completed, and in 1898, the church celebrated its centennial, reinforcing the date that is included on the register plaques that you'll see today. Then, faithfully, in 1916, the third church was destroyed by fire. Undaunted, the members immediately undertook a rebuilding effort with the assistance of a design firm, Creer and Hastings. In 1918, a parish hall and chapel, the present administrative offices and this very chapel, were completed as the first phase. Construction of the sanctuary itself, postponed because of World War I, was completed in the 1922-23 time frame. The cornerstone of the church structure was laid October 12, 1922, which you can see in the corner. And the building was completed and dedicated on October 21, 1923. Some really nice material is in the back of the room on that, in that regard. To add further texture to this event and our recognition of this building and cemetery today, it seems appropriate to give witness to some of those who were involved in the building of this great structure. By sharing these thoughts, some background of the design firm, and indeed the design itself, I hope to convey once again that this congregation sought to give honor to its rich history while leaning with great expectations into the future. First, a statement of the building committee, written as the design of the church was nearing completion, reported that it was, and I quote, "not uncommon to see over 400 people crowded into our chapel. And we believe that the time has come to complete our plant by erecting the adequate church edifice. Our architects, Creer and Hastings of New York, hold first rank among the architects of America, and the building they are designing for us is pronounced to be the firm's masterpiece in church architecture. This commanding structure will add character and tone to the town, increase the value of real estate, and generally strengthen the commercial integrity of the community. Irrespective of religious affiliation, every man and woman, every boy and girl may point with just pride to the edifice of the Wellesley Congregational Church." While earlier buildings of the congregation had been referred to as meeting house, the new project was envisioned as a house of worship. Creer and Hastings was indeed a world-renowned architectural firm. known for Beaux Arts masterpieces. A short list of their work tells the story. The New York Library, the Frick House, now Frick Collection Museum. Renovations of the U.S. Capitol, Senate Office Building, the House Office Building, and the Carnegie Institute in Washington, D.C. Locally at Elm Bank, the Alice Cheney Baltzel House was built in 1907. Similar to the church, it was designed in the Georgian Revival style, and in fact, the Baltzel House, built a decade or so before the Wellesley Congregational Church complex was started, may have led the church building committee to Career and Hastings. A quote from Thomas Hastings, principal architect at Career and Hastings, described his intent for the church. In determining upon the general style and character of the proposed Wellesley Congregational Church, and after several interviews with the building committee, it was agreed that for a New England town, unusual results might be obtained by building a colonial or what approximates a Georgian 18th century edifice. Such a building, in our opinion, will be a real contribution to the character of the town and its civic improvement on the part of the members of the church. Indeed, so much so that we believe that all people, even those who do not attend the church, but are interested in the welfare of the town of Wellesley, should gladly be willing to contribute to make this church a real success. In referring to the past in his design for the church complex, Hastings recalled the earliest history of this congregation's dating back to the late 18th century and brought Wellesley into the 20th century with the use of Georgian Revival architecture of this building. Whether seen in the symmetry and balance of the colonial revival architecture or the Georgian and federal design features such as columns, impediments, and porticos, etc., it is clear that much of this noble structure still exists, which brings us to the building we are celebrating today. The sanctuary, while expanded and made accessible in the 2002 renovation, would be clearly recognizable by those who were present in its initial construction. Renovations to the present Burt Chapel were relatively minor at that time. The changes in 2002 were primarily designed to add efficiency to the entire building, upgrade the common facilities and church schoolrooms, and make the entire building accessible. The cemetery, also dating back to the earliest years of the town, had its own journey and is another example of the church's rich history, even to the casual observer. As you walk west from Village Common, one is first aware of the older headstones lined up essentially in rows in this older eastern portion of the cemetery. Changes and upgrades to the cemetery in the latter half of the 1800s were mentioned earlier. In the 1930s, the cemetery came into disrepair again due to foot traffic and neglect, prompting a taller outer wall that we see today. In 1946, a cedar fence on the cemetery's east side, abutting the church property, was erected. Perhaps the most important change in the cemetery to occur was during 2002 renovation, again, when the cemetery and the church became intricately connected. The cemetery and church were previously separated by a road set below grade to that of the cemetery. If you could make it up the incline and walking across the road toward the cemetery, then you had to climb over the cedar fence to get into the cemetery. With 2002 refurbishment, the village common was added, leading into the western portico, and the ground between the church and the cemetery was made to grade. The cedar fence was removed, and the cemetery was fully opened up and accessible to its members. In response to some wishes that were expressed during the 2002 renovation and the discernment process which preceded that, a group was formed to reopen the cemetery. In 2007, Memorial Path was consecrated with the opening of a 150 by 10.5 feet path, formerly a carriage path, for the interment of cremated remains and the installation of 3 shared headstones. In 2015, 5 more headstones were installed. In conclusion, as we began, we end with a statement that the earliest history of Wellesley and of this church are one and the same. And in retrospect, it didn't seem easy. Construction of 2 of the 4 structures built in this very property were delayed by war. This building we celebrate today, the 4th, is a response to the 1916 fire which destroyed the 3rd structure. There were sacrifices made as evidence in the 11 Revolutionary War and 2 Civil War veterans whose remains lay in the hallowed ground of our cemetery. Yet one can imagine the excitement that seemed to sweep over this area, this congregation, and this town in the mid to late 1800s. The transformation of Wellesley from a rural town to a more affluent Boston suburb, the Boston and Worcester Railroad coming through, connecting Wellesley to other communities, the church community taking full ownership of the building and cemetery, becoming a church only and no longer a meeting house, significant connections with Wellesley College and Dana Hall. This wave of growth and enthusiasm seemed to lay the groundwork for the immediate and incredible response that followed the 1916 fire despite World War I. They didn't just replace the former building. They sought to design a building worthy of this church's place in the rich history of Wellesley and of Wellesley Congregational Church. In the design chosen and expressed intent was to reach back to capture the splendor of our forefathers, but make a statement for future generations. So today we celebrate the placement of this church and cemetery on the National Register of Historic Places. But perhaps more importantly, we pause to honor those who have come before us and made it possible for this celebration to even occur. Thank you. And I would love now for Sarah to come up and share any thoughts she might have and give us the good and great honor of unveiling the plaques.
I'm pretty moved by that story. Are you? It's amazing to think about the people, the men and women, the families, the households, like yourselves, who had such faith and vision in the midst of adversity, challenge, in a time of becoming. They wanted to become a congregation. They wanted to become a church. They wanted to become a sacred place. And they wanted to become a place that was invested in the well-being of the community around them. You can almost hear how they didn't even think of it as separate, right? Church and community, community and church. Permeable boundary. What a vision for us to be a church like that. A church so invested in the well-being of our community, to be a place where all people, regardless of faith and of tradition, could come and contribute whatever they have to contribute. With their spirit, with their joy, with their energy, with their lives. I'm very moved by the history. And Kirk, I'm indebted to you and to those who helped you, Brad and many others, to put together that story for us. A powerful story and a living story. Honored to be the 18th pastor of a church. So we dedicate something today that far predates us and that will live on beyond all of us. And to be in the great arc of God's story, to take our place in it, to be inspired by those who've gone before, to be those who live as becometh saints today. That's where we are just now. In dedication, I'd like to offer a prayer, and then I'm going to ask Kirk to come back up here for the unveiling. Will that be all right? All right. This prayer starts with my own words and then ends with the words that were the prayer at the bottom of the original covenant. Okay? Let us pray together. Sovereign God, we thank you for those people throughout the ages whose lives have honored you, whose hands and hearts have built your church, that we might find sanctuary here in our own time. We give you thanks for those whose generosity of resource and spirit have blessed us, whose love has touched us, and whose light has brightened our days. O God, we thank you for those before us who chose the way of Christ, who built a church to give the body of Christ a home, who made its mission real in the world, and who have invited us in our time to travel that life-giving path. Use their lives to inspire ours. Now the good Lord be merciful to us, and as he hath put it into our hearts thus to devote ourselves unto him, let him pity and pardon all our frailties, humble us out of all carnal confidence, and keep it evermore upon our hearts to be faithful to himself and to one another, for his praise and for our eternal comfort, for Christ's sake and for the sake of the church in the world. Be glory forever. Amen. Amen. Drum roll, please. Come on. Pound those feet. Should we do them together? 1, 2, 3. Woo! So I'm going to read it out loud for you. Wellesley Congregational Church and Cemetery, organized in 1798, are listed in the National Register of Historic Places by the United States Department of the Interior. Congratulations. So be it, and may it be so.
I don't recall a more beautiful All Saints Day service, so thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Liz. It was beautiful. And the choir, Ave Verum Corpus, yes, yes, yes. Oh, thank you, thank you. And while we're thanking, as the preacher once said, before I make my remarks, I have something to say. I do want to thank, first and foremost, Jim Nealon here, who on short notice said, yes, I will help, not a worry, and he just picks you up and takes you there. Thank you. Cindy Miller, who allowed us to use the walls. Thank you, Cindy. It's kind of haphazard, but we put up what we had, and she was so enthusiastic, and I appreciated it. Roger Rainier, who was with us and me throughout this entire process, who always really cared. Roger, where are you? There you are. Thank you for being a partner. Jim Mangiardo, who somehow found himself having the responsibility for ordering the plaques and making sure the fonts are right, and in fact that the locations would be perfectly placed. So all of that has been well thought out, and he was significant in that. I have to say, in the past couple of weeks, a particular note to Craig and Pam Steeritt, Sarah Butter, and my wife Nancy, who picked me up and helped me over the finish line. Or maybe we should say they came in and were a nice closer. How about that? Something like that. Maybe that's better. I'm going to try to not, stay with it, but why not? And I want to say hello to Carolyn, Nancy's sister. Where are you, Carolyn? There she is. She's in town. It's always nice to share things with Carolyn. Bless her heart. I affectionately call her the whirling dervish. Today we are gathered to recognize and celebrate the event of this church property, both in the building and in our cemetery, being added to the National Register of Historic Places. It's always... I get it wrong. As a matter of fact, I left out the word national, which I just wrote in. And this is done by the U.S. Department of Interior. The application process is a rigorous and somewhat time-consuming one, involving the creation of a detailed application, which is submitted to the State Historical Commission for its review, acceptance, and recommendation. The state then forwards the application to the National Park Service, which administers this process to the Department of Interior, for the Department of Interior, for final review and approval. The entire process took approximately 3 years, a process initiated by our beloved church member, historian, and my close friend, Brad Harding. Who could not be here with us today, but is in our hearts and here in spirit. Brad's and my first and best decision was to ask Sherry Berg, preservation planner, to drive the application process for us. I knew Sherry from the work she did on the development of Memorial Path, and it was Sherry who introduced the church to Karen Sprague, who so beautifully engraves our headstones in Memorial Path. When I reread Sherry's application this summer, now not for edits, but for preparation for this day, I was very moved. It is a high-quality piece of work, and I highly recommend it to anyone interested in the deep history of this church. I have copies in the back, and I can give anybody who wants. I just didn't presume 25 of you want to read a National Register application. I have done my best to condense it for your use today, but assure you there is much more to be enjoyed by reading this. Sherry could not be with us today, and neither could Josh Doran and David Wright, two individuals who served on the Wellesley Historical Commission, which, following a meeting Brad and I had with them, added an addendum to our application, not required, totally voluntarily, in support of this acceptance by the state. It added texture, and it was really a nice gesture of community. I also want to give notice at this time and thank Addison Bauer, son of Sherry and James Bauer. Some of you may know, Addison is presently a freshman at University of Michigan. It was Addison who, in an Eagle Scout project, when with the team that he oversaw, cataloged every headstone in our cemetery. An incredible feat by this extraordinary young man and a true gift of the church. I just wanted to recognize him today because I was not directly involved in this process, but coincidental in the time period that we're dealing with here.